Do you ever wonder?
Yeah. Do you ever wonder where you came from? Who were your ancestors? Where did they live? What did they do? And if you can work it out, why did they live where they live? And why did they move? All sorts of fascinating things can therefore be found by accessing all the information that's available now online to see the answer to some of those questions.
What do you want to find out?
Where do I come from? How far can I go back? Also, what is the truth behind Auntie Maud's story? Did she have 3 husbands, only one husband and many lovers? Did she have all legitimate children? All sorts of interesting questions can be asked.
Which records can you find?
The records you can find online currently are records from parish registers. Parish registers started in 1538, but not many parishes actually did it. Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII tried to use it as a tax raising system, a bit like the community charges was. Then Queen Elizabeth I recognised that this was actually valuable and put some money into it from 1597. That proceeded all the way until 1837, when the government decided that we should introduce civil registration rather than being dependent on parish priests and curates. So from the 1st of July 1837, the civil records have been registered. All births, marriages and deaths have been registered. I say all, in theory, all. There are also lots of records about where people lived from census records that start from 1841, and we're about to have the 1921 census issued to the public from the 1st of January. This is a critical one because after that there's a 30-year gap before there's another census. 1931 the census was taken, but it was blitzed in the Second World War. In 1941 they clearly didn't take the census. They had other things on their minds, and therefore there's a gap between 1921, when you can search where people live, and 1951, which is a big gap. There are also probate records which allow you to find which of your ancestors left anything. The wills are usually attached to the probate records. There are wills, and before, this started in 1858. Before 1858, there are wills, but it tended to be people who had money, land, property. Whereas from 1858 onwards, it can be all sorts of people, especially valuable and maiden aunts, who tended to therefore distribute their estate widely. Then the last is a much more recent thing of looking at gravestones. Lots of people have gone out into different cemeteries and churchyards and recorded gravestones, and those records are now increasingly online. I think in Devon there are 120,000 or some such number from across the county. So there are lots of records now online.
So where's the best place to begin?
The best place to begin is you. You start with you, right? Get a large piece of paper, write your name at somewhere near the bottom, and then work backwards. Family history is done working backwards. It's much too tricky to work forwards. So you work out your parents and their parents, i.e. your grandparents, all 4 of them, and then you keep on going backwards. In all the years I've been doing this, it's amazing how many people don't know their grandparents or don't know their grandparents' names. They only know them as granny and granddad. They don't actually know what their names are. So there's a lot to be done. And once you start going back, you can start getting access to the records and follow it backwards. As for example, on a birth certificate, it has not only your father's name and your mother's name, but your mother's maiden name. On a marriage certificate, you have each person, the groom and the bride's fathers recorded and their occupations. So you can say, I think this is the right one. So that's where you start.
So what are the major sources, John?
The major sources are accessed via pieces of software. The most well-known is Ancestry. Ancestry is an extensive source of records, the ones I've listed and many more, migration and immigration records, i.e. who went out on what ships and where they came from, all sorts of war records, etc. Ancestry is available in all Torbay libraries on the computers, and you can use a computer in Torquay Library for free to access Ancestry. Once a month, we run an Ancestry support group in Torquay Library, 2 hours, 10 till 12, first Wednesday of the month. And there you will find people like me to help you. In addition, you can do this at home, but Ancestry costs money for a private subscription. Find My Past, which is its competitor, also costs money. However, there are free records that you can access at home. Family Search is the most extensive, which is provided through the auspices of the Church of Latter-day Saints, who are trying to record the birth of everybody since the Bible. Now, some of that is pretty tricky, but that means they have an extensive collection of records from all over the world. And then there are other groups that have produced free indexes to records that you can access at home for nothing, and it will tell you all the details you need to order, for example, a birth certificate or a marriage certificate.
So once you've started on this journey and you've checked those things, what do you do next, John?
I think what you do next is you started off with an idea of what you wanted to do, what you wanted to find out. And by the time you've done a lot of research, you will have found all sorts of other things, which leads you off in different paths. So one of the things you have to do is be diligent about recording what you found and where you found it, and preferably when you found it, just so you don't repeat yourself. There are lots of other things you can do. There are software products that you can purchase for your own computer that will keep your records for you. Some people use those. I use one myself that cost me 40 quid roughly. And that allows me to record all the records that I found, photographs. You can scan photographs in, you can produce narrative additions, you can keep all sorts of things. So that's what you do, because somehow you've got to keep all this information. Otherwise, as the person who taught me how to do this said, I don't wish to know that you have lots of scrappy bits of paper. Okay,
and the trick question.
Yeah,
I'm sure you can answer it, no problem. How far back have you gone, and what interesting stories have you come up with?
The answer to the how far have you got back depends on, like all these things, which branch of the family you're looking at. The easiest ones to get back a long way are the people who stayed in the same place. Chris, my wife's ancestors, who her father's ancestors who came from farming family in rural Hampshire around Ringwood. They were there for hundreds of years. So you can get back, we've got back to the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century there. Whereas some of the Welsh ones, for example, become tricky because the Welsh have had a different naming system the further back you go. They didn't have surnames. So it gets somewhat trickier. Others, it's simply that the records have disappeared, as I might say, through fire, flood or pestilence, i.e. mice or rats eating the registers. As far as I'm concerned, I'll give you one story. My father had 3 Christian names, the third one of which was his mother's maiden name. It was Pask, P-A-S-K. So I started looking, and as I started looking, I got confused because it turns out that, of course, my grandmother wasn't called Pask. She was born with another. She was born to a different father than that. She was born to someone called Cobb, C-O-B-B. And therefore I have to follow the Cobb records, even though she called herself Mary Ann Pask. So that's the sort of thing that can cause you interesting sidelines. Why did she call herself Pask when that was in fact her mother's name, not her father's name? So there are all sorts of things that came out of that. When her mother was producing her second child, my grandmother being the first, my grandmother was parcelled off aged something like 2 or 3 to her grandparents, Samuel and Mary Pask. So that's, as far as she knew, by the time she was conscious, she was a Pask, because she never went back to live with her birth parents. So all sorts of interesting things come out. I think one other brief story. Pre-pandemic, we used to go to places that we'd found on family history that were interesting. And we went one day to a little village called Whittington in Gloucestershire. And we had a postcard of Whittington dated 1910, I think. And we drove into the village, stopped at a T-junction, and Chris had the postcard. I was driving and she looked at it, she said, "This is the place. It's the same photograph. I could take the same photograph now, apart from the metal chains around the village green, which were taken down and used melted in the First World War for other purposes." So there are fascinating things you can find and fascinating places you can go.